November 15th, 1315. A narrow mountain pass carved through the Swiss Alps, squeezed between forest and frozen water. 9,000 armored knights entered at sunrise. Europe's finest cavalry, men draped music, in steel that cost more than villages produced in a year, carrying bloodlines that had ruled music, since Charlemagne, flying banners that represented centuries of unquestioned dominance. By noon, some were face down in frozen lake water, their armor pulling them under like anchors. Others were crawling through mud and ice with halberds buried in their spines, begging for mercy that would never come. A few made it to the shoreline, looked back at what the farmers were doing with their hooks and axes, and chose drowning instead. This wasn't a battle in any traditional sense. It was music, an execution dressed as one. A systematic dismantling of everything medieval Europe believed about power, nobility, music, and divine right. 1,500 peasants, men who owned no land, carried no titles, wore no armor, possessed nothing but terrain and rage, didn't just win. They turned knighthood itself into a punchline written in blood and ice water. What you're about to hear is how confidence became a weapon, how a mountain pass became a tomb, how terrain turned into an executioner, and how the men who spent their lives enforcing Europe's hierarchy learned exactly what it feels like when that hierarchy music snaps in half. This is Morgarten, and nothing was ever quite the same after. By 1314, Europe's power structure was mechanical, simple, unquestioned for so long that questioning it seemed unnatural. Nobles owned the land because God and conquest said they did. Knights enforced that ownership with steel and training that began in childhood. Peasants worked the fields until their bodies gave out. The church blessed the arrangement. The system worked because it had always worked, and it would continue working because no one had the weapons or organization to make it stop. Then there were the forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, 3 alpine communities tucked into mountains that made farming difficult, music, and conquest expensive. They existed outside the standard feudal arrangement, not through rebellion, but through geographic accident and legal technicality. They weren't serfs bound to noble estates. They governed themselves through local assemblies where farmers and herders voted on matters that elsewhere would be decided by men in castles. They paid taxes directly to the Holy Roman Emperor, not to regional dukes, not to Habsburg intermediaries, not to anyone who believed their music existence was something that could be negotiated away. To the Habsburgs, this wasn't charming local tradition. It was a crack in the foundation, a loophole that needed closing before others noticed it existed. The St. Gothard Pass cut directly through these territories, the critical trade artery connecting northern Europe to the wealth, music, pouring out of Italy. Silk, spices, banking documents, mercenary contracts. Everything that made the Mediterranean economy function flowed through those mountain routes. Whoever controlled the pass controlled tariffs, controlled troop movements, controlled which merchants, music prospered, and which went bankrupt, controlled leverage over every kingdom that depended on Italian trade. The Habsburgs, music, wanted total control. The Swiss wanted to remain outside the transaction entirely. For years, this tension simmered without boiling over. The Swiss tried every diplomatic avenue available. They sent formal petitions appealing to imperial authority. They argued their case through legal channels that moved with medieval bureaucratic slowness. They attempted to coexist within a system that fundamentally didn't recognize coexistence as an option. It didn't matter. The petitions went unanswered. The legal arguments disappeared into administrative silence. Coexistence was never the goal. In 1314, men from Schwyz raided Einsiedeln Abbey, a wealthy Benedictine monastery sitting on productive land. Its walls filled music, with gold liturgical objects and stored grain, its authority backed by direct Habsburg music protection. The raid itself wasn't particularly unusual by medieval standards. Monastic institutions were frequent targets of local disputes. Wealth concentrated in the hands of celibate. Music, men tends to attract resentment, especially when those men collect taxes and enforce feudal obligations on behalf of distant nobles. Monks were seized and held. Property was looted systematically. Treasures disappeared into the mountains where no Habsburg official would dare follow without an army. But this wasn't just another monastery. It was a Habsburg asset, an extension of ducal power wrapped in religious legitimacy, an institution that existed specifically to project authority into territory the Habsburgs, music, didn't technically control yet. The message was unmistakable, impossible to misinterpret. We do not recognize your authority here. We will not ask permission to exist. Try to enforce your claims, and we will resist. Duke Leopold I of Austria didn't need more provocation than that. He began assembling an army not to negotiate terms, not to punish proportionally, not to restore order through measured response. He organized a force of 9,000 knights, men of the highest station, to remind the Swiss exactly who held power. The Swiss had no such army. They had no resources, no land to draw from. What they did have was a geography that made any foreign military campaign a nightmare, a place where the very mountains they lived in had a voice of their own. And on November 15th, they made sure the Habsburgs heard it. As the knights entered the narrow pass, the mountains seemed to close in around them. The ground was muddy, frozen in places, treacherous for men used to the open field. It was the perfect environment for the peasants to take advantage of the Habsburgs' overconfidence. The battle that ensued wasn't just a defeat, it was a humiliation. The peasants fought with hooks, axes, anything they could grab. They used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to fight with lethal efficiency. In the end, it wasn't the knights' superior equipment or training that mattered. It was the terrain, the geography, and the will of the people who knew it best. By the end of the day, thousands of Habsburg soldiers lay dead, scattered in the snow, while 1,500 Swiss peasants stood victorious, their power now undeniable. This was going to be public, theatrical, humiliating, a demonstration of what happened when peasants forgot their place in the hierarchy that God himself had ordained. By autumn of 1315, Leopold had gathered thousands of music, knights, and cavalry from across Habsburg territories. Men who had trained for war since childhood. Men whose armor alone represented wealth most peasants would never see in their lifetimes. Men who understood that music, their entire social function, was crushing exactly this kind of resistance. Chroniclers who saw the army assembled described it as confident to the point of boredom. There was no expectation of actual resistance. These were farmers, herders, men who spent their days managing livestock and arguing about grazing rights. They would scatter at the sight of cavalry. They always did. History said so. The plan was straightforward. The kind of military operation that Habsburg commanders had executed dozens of times. March through Morgarten Pass in overwhelming force. Crush any token resistance with minimal casualties. Occupy the canton. Install loyal administrators. Restore proper feudal order. Make sure everyone in the Alps understood that independence was temporary and obedience was permanent. What Leopold didn't understand, what he fundamentally couldn't understand, given everything his world had taught him since birth, was that the Swiss had stopped asking for permission. They weren't preparing petitions. They were preparing the mountain. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you want more history. They deliberately left out of your textbooks. What's about to happen in this pass is exactly why those in power prefer you never hear these stories. Morgarten Pass was not a battlefield. It was a geographic sentence waiting to be read aloud. Picture a narrow corridor barely wide enough for an army marching in column formation. On the eastern side, a steep forested slope, rising sharply, covered in loose rocks and avalanche debris, thick undergrowth, centuries of fallen timber. On the western side, Lake Igori, cold and deep even in summer. In mid-November, the surface had started to freeze, in patches. Thin ice that could support nothing. Water beneath that would stop a heart in minutes. Between the slope and the lake, just enough room for horses, armor, supply wagons, and the absolute certainty that peasants wouldn't dare attack professional soldiers here. That certainty was the trap. The Habsburg army entered the pass in dense formation. Knights rode in the center. Surrounded by lighter cavalry and infantry. Supply wagons followed, banners flew, armor gleamed, horses struggled slightly on icy ground, hooves slipping occasionally, but nothing that suggested danger. The march was slow, deliberate. The kind of pace an army adopts when it believes the war is already over, and the rest is just ceremony. Above them, completely hidden in the tree line, the peasants watched and waited. They had been there for hours, perhaps days, positioning everything, perfectly. This wasn't ambush. This was engineering. They knew the army was coming. They knew the exact route. They knew precisely where the column would be most compressed, most unable to maneuver. They had gathered boulders over weeks, boulders the size of wine barrels, some larger, masses of stone that normally took teams of oxen to move. They positioned them along the slope at carefully calculated intervals, held in place, by wooden barriers and rope. They collected logs, thick timber from trees, that had stood for decades, heavy enough to crush bone and steel. These weren't siege weapons, just gravity, mass, and an understanding of what happens when you give physics a steep slope to work with. The Swiss didn't have cavalry. They didn't have plate armor, that cost annual incomes. They had the mountain. They had terrain they'd walked their entire lives. They had local knowledge worth more than steel. And they had planned what happens when you give the mountain a push at exactly the right moment. Below, the Habsburg column continued forward, oblivious, confident, committed. The pass narrowed further. Horses bunched together. Space between riders disappeared. Retreat would now require the entire army to reverse course in a confined corridor while under attack. Nearly impossible. The Swiss let them get deeper, let the front of the column commit, let the rear get fully enclosed. Then they cut the ropes and removed the barriers, music, and released the mountain. The attack didn't announce itself. No horns, no drums, no warnings, just the sound of ropes snapping under tension, wood cracking as barriers gave way, and then the deep building rumble of mass beginning to move downhill with gathering speed. Boulders the size of wine barrels tumbled into the column from above. Not falling straight down, bouncing, picking up speed, hitting outcroppings and changing direction unpredictably, becoming projectiles that weighed hundreds of pounds and moved faster than horses could run. Logs followed. Thick, heavy timber rolling and tumbling end over end, building momentum, sweeping away anything in their path. The sound was overwhelming. Rock striking rock, wood splintering, horses screaming, men shouting warnings that arrived too late. Boulders crashed into the tightly packed column. Music, with catastrophic results. Horses went down immediately, legs shattered, riders music thrown. Knights in full plate armor were struck from above and knocked sideways directly into the lake. Some broke through the thin ice and disappeared immediately, armor pulling them down before they could draw breath to scream. Others tried to swim, hands clawing at water, but plate armor doesn't cooperate with buoyancy. The physics are simple and merciless. Steel is heavier than water. Exhaustion happens, music, quickly in freezing temperatures, and drowning becomes inevitable. Chroniclers recorded men, music, clawing desperately at straps and buckles, trying to shed steel that had cost music fortunes and was now pulling them under. Some succeeded in removing helmets or gauntlets. Most didn't. Most just sank. The ones who stayed on land weren't safer. They were just dying differently. The column had fractured instantly into isolated pockets. No unified formation, music remained. Horses were down everywhere, dead, dying, panicked and running. Riders were dismounted. Music surrounded by chaos. Some tried to organize. Training took over. Officers shouted commands. Small groups formed defensive music circles. Shields locked, but there was no front line to hold. No enemy charged to meet with lances. Just chaos spreading faster than orders could travel. That's when the music, peasants came down the slope. They didn't charge like knights. They descended fast and controlled, moving through trees and over rocks with the sure-footedness of men who had walked this exact terrain music since childhood. They moved like water finding cracks, spreading through the fractured column, appearing suddenly from tree line and boulder field. They carried halberds, a weapon that's part spear, part axe with a hook attached behind the blade, not a nobleman's weapon. A tool designed for one specific battlefield task, pulling armored men off horses and killing them on the ground where armor becomes a liability. The Swiss used them exactly as intended. A halberd hook, music, catches a knight's armor, shoulder plate, neck guard, breastplate, edge, and pulls hard. Physics does the rest. The rider comes off the horse. He hits the ground music, hard, weighed down by steel that was supposed to protect him, but now pins him. Before he can get up, before he can draw a weapon, the axe end comes down. Through joints where plate armor doesn't cover, through gaps in the armor at armpits and groin, through anything that isn't solid, music steel. One strike usually wasn't enough. Medieval armor was effective. But 2 strikes, 3, concentrated on the same joint or gap. Music, that was enough. Armor that had cost annual incomes became a prison. It slowed movement. It trapped limbs. It made running impossible and drowning easier and fighting back. Music exhausting. Knights tried to fight back. Some managed to draw swords. Some formed small groups, shields locked, backs together, waiting for rescue. But there was no rescue coming. The rear of the column was blocked by music, rockfall, and dead horses. The front was pinned against the lake. Nowhere to charge, nowhere to retreat, just isolated sections of an army being dismantled piece by men who showed no interest. In ransom negotiations, music, the Swiss didn't take prisoners, didn't accept surrenders, didn't honor the complex rules that governed combat between nobles. This wasn't a tournament. There were no ransoms to negotiate. These were men who had been raided, taxed, music threatened, and told repeatedly that their independence was temporary. Men who had tried diplomacy and received silence. Men who understood that losing this fight meant occupation and the end of everything. That made their communities different. They fought accordingly. Chroniclers described scenes they struggled to fit into the language of medieval warfare. Knights in full armor, begging for quarter, offering ransoms, invoking noble obligations, and receiving halberd strikes instead. Armored men crawling on hands and knees toward the lake, choosing freezing water over what was happening behind them with the hooks and axes. Horses running riderless through the pass, trampling the wounded, spreading panic. One account describes a group of knights who made it to the shoreline, looked back at the slaughter, and waded into Lake Agri deliberately, not fleeing in panic, not trying to swim to safety, just walking forward into deeper water until it covered their helmets, and the weight of their armor pulled them under. They knew armor doesn't music float. They understood the physics. They chose it anyway. Drowning was preferable. The fighting lasted less than 2 hours. When it stopped, the pass was littered with bodies, broken equipment, dead horses, and the wreckage of an army that had entered expecting submission and found something entirely different. Duke Leopold I of Austria survived. He fled with a small group of mounted knights who broke free early. He made it back to Habsburg territory alive. He continued ruling, continued campaigning, lived for another 11 years before dying in battle against the Swiss again at Siege in 1386 in another engagement where peasant infantry defeated noble cavalry. But Morgarten followed him for the rest of his life. Because survival wasn't the problem, explaining survival was the problem. How do you tell the rest of Europe that your professional army was destroyed by farmers in a mountain pass? How do you frame that without making every nobleman reconsider what armor and bloodlines are actually worth? You can't. There's no framework for it, no language, music, that preserves the hierarchy while explaining its failure. So, the narrative fractured immediately into competing explanations. Some chroniclers blamed terrain exclusively. The pass was uniquely difficult. The ice was unseasonably treacherous. Bad luck could have happened to anyone. Others blamed weather. An early winter storm, fog, snow, natural factors beyond human control. A few suggested darker explanations. Music, witchcraft, demons, divine intervention, God punishing Habsburg arrogance. Though that raised uncomfortable questions, music, about why the Almighty would side with peasants against anointed, music nobility. What almost none of the official accounts would admit was the simple truth. The Swiss had prepared the battlefield, understood their tactical advantages, and executed a plan that turned knightly strengths into fatal music weaknesses. They had treated war like an engineering problem instead of a test of noble virtue. They had used terrain as a weapon, and more effectively than any sword. And it worked completely decisively. News of Morgarten spread across Europe within weeks. Not through formal diplomatic music channels, those tried to minimize the disaster, but through merchants, mercenaries, travelers, servants who overheard noble conversations. The reaction wasn't celebration. It was fear. Because Morgarten proved that the entire military structure of feudal Europe, expensive horses, hereditary training, armor that cost more than villages produced, music bloodlines traced back to Charlemagne, could be systematically countered by men with basic weapons and good terrain knowledge. It proved that peasants with motivation and preparation could kill nobles. Not through luck, not through divine intervention, through planning. That was the terrifying part. Not the loss itself, but what music suggested about vulnerability, about whether the hierarchy was as stable as everyone had been taught to believe. The Swiss formalized what Morgarten had proven. Uri, Schwytz, and Unwalden signed a mutual defense pact immediately. The federal charter that became the foundation of Switzerland. More cantons joined over the following decades. Music, the confederation grew, and their infantry became the most sought-after mercenaries music in Europe. Not because they were the most skilled individually, not because they had the best equipment, but because they had proven at Morgarten that music would not break. That when pushed to the edge, when facing overwhelming force, when given the choice between submission and violence, they would choose violence and execute it effectively. Kings hired them. The Pope filled his palace guard with them. The Swiss Guard that still exists today traces its origins to this period. Armies across Europe adopted pike formations in imitation of Swiss tactics. Commanders learned to avoid fighting them if possible. All because 1,500 peasants turned a mountain pass into a graveyard for an idea that had ruled Europe for centuries. The real casualty of Morgarten wasn't the Habsburg army. It was the belief system that sent them into that pass. For centuries, European society had operated on a premise so fundamental it barely needed music stating. Some men were born to rule, others born to obey, and the difference was enforced by steel and sanctified by God's will. Knights weren't just soldiers. They were proof music that the system worked. Evidence that years of training, noble bloodlines, expensive equipment, music, and divine favor would always defeat improvisation and desperation. The entire social structure depended on this being true. Lords collected music taxes because they provided protection. That protection came from knights. Knights were effective because their training and equipment made them superior to common soldiers.
In 1279, an empire stretched from the Sea of Japan to Eastern Europe. At the peak of its power, the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's landmass. Yet, within less than a century, it completely disintegrated. What's puzzling is that there was no single battle marking the end of this mighty empire. No burning of Rome, no defining Waterloo. The Mongol Empire's collapse occurred gradually, and history books often overlook the true cause. Today, let's explore the question, what really brought down the greatest empire of the medieval world? But before we dive into the details, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Drop a comment below. I'm curious to see how far this video has reached. And if you enjoy history told in an unconventional way, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell. Now, let's rewind the clock to 1227. In August of that year, Genghis Khan passed away during a campaign in China. His death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of an existential challenge for the empire he built. He left behind an extraordinary legacy, a vast empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea, twice the size of the Roman Empire or the Islamic Caliphate at their peaks. However, Genghis also left a critical problem. How do you govern an empire that one man could conquer on horseback, but couldn't rule from the saddle? The Mongols were fundamentally nomadic people. Their culture was based on constant movement. Winters in the south, summers in the northern steppes. Their yurt homes could be packed up in an hour, and their entire way of life was designed for mobility. But now, they ruled over China, a civilization known for its complex bureaucracy. They controlled Persia, an ancient civilization with sophisticated urban centers. They dominated lands where people lived in fixed homes, farmed settled plots of land, and viewed staying in one place as a symbol of civilization. This contradiction would eventually tear the Mongol Empire apart from within. Mongol tradition dictated that the empire was a collective property of the royal family. Genghis Khan divided the lands among his four sons, Yochi, Chagatai, Ogade, and Talyui. However, Genghis chose Ogade to be the great Khan, the supreme ruler. Ogade was a wise choice. Unlike his brothers, he had no excessive personal ambitions and was respected by all. Under Ogade's rule, the Mongol Empire continued to expand. Mongol armies devastated Budapest in 1241, reaching deep into the heart of Europe. But in December 1241, Ogade suddenly died. His death marked the beginning of a crisis that would shake the empire to its core. The first collapse. 2 years of chaos after Ogade's death, the empire plunged into 2 years of chaos. No new great Khan was elected, and the Mongol princes withdrew their armies, competing for power. Europe, which had been on the brink of destruction, was saved not by military might, but by the internal crisis within the Mongol leadership. Eventually, Ogade's son, Gayuk, took the throne in 1246, but his reign lasted only 2 years before he too died. This succession crisis revealed a fundamental weakness in the Mongol system. When the empire relied on exceptional individuals, it was fragile. The system's inherent instability was now exposed. The rise of Mancha Khan in 1251, Mancha Khan, the son of Talyui, ascended to the throne. His reign was a significant shift from Ogade's lineage to Talyui's, and not all princes were happy about this change. Nevertheless, Mancha was a strong leader, and he managed to reunify the empire. He continued the Mongol conquests, assigning his brothers Kublai and Hulagu important tasks. Kublai was charged with completing the conquest of China, while Hulagu was ordered to march west. In 1258, Hulagu achieved a historic victory by capturing and destroying Baghdad, a city that had been the center of the Islamic world for 5 centuries. This was a significant achievement, but it came with unintended consequences. The hidden price of victory. The plague modern genetic research suggests that during their campaigns, Mongol armies inadvertently disturbed a deadly pathogen in the marmot populations of the Tian Shan Mountains. This pathogen, Yersinia pestis, is a bacterium that causes plague. The Mongols unwittingly spread the disease across Eurasia, setting the stage for the Black Death, which would go on to kill over 100 million people. But in 1259, Mancha Khan died suddenly during a campaign against the Song dynasty in China. Mancha was only about 50 years old, and he left no clear successor. This was the Mongol Empire's point of no return. The second collapse. A civil war for the throne would mark his death. His two brothers, Kubla and Aribok, both claimed the title of Great Khan. Kubla, stationed in China, was supported by those who wanted to continue the empire's development along sedentary lines, learning from the civilizations they had conquered. Aribok, on the other hand, was in the Mongol homeland and was supported by those who wanted to preserve the traditional nomadic way of life. This wasn't just a power struggle. It was a conflict over the very soul of the Mongol Empire. The decision between adopting a sedentary, bureaucratic model of governance and maintaining a nomadic, warrior-based lifestyle would determine the future of the Mongol Empire. This conflict wasn't just a political dispute. It represented a cultural divide between two radically different ways of life.